So the question is, given what we know about the history and the kind of major themes that are sort of commonly upheld, what kind of reconstruction of the Markan community could we do? This is a key text in Mark, which kind of people just kind of gloss over, but it kind of gives you a little window into what's going on in the Markan community. It's kind of a hint at that. Let me get my notes here. So I'm not going to read the text to you because I hate when people read PowerPoint slides to me verbatim, and so I won't subject you to the same, unpleasantness. But the idea here is that the text that's in red is, that sibling will hand over sibling, and that parents their children, and that children will rise up against their parents and have them put to death. That's the kind of the key text. Like, why would Mark say that? Isn't that strange? Like, what's at stake here? Why would you say such a thing? And that the idea that the destruction of the temple, which is very much on Mark's mind, is not just sort of a casual event that happens, but it's the Roman Empire's reprisal for, the Jewish revolt that begins in 64, and then, ends in Masada in 73. And that Jesus' crucifixion, so the destruction of the temple in some ways for Mark is parallel to the destruction of Jesus. Jesus is destroyed, right? Destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it in 3 days. So the Roman Empire's, the crucifixion is the way the Roman Empire destroys things. It's their instrument of terror and the way they prevent and try to prevent people from, resisting their rule, which they think is legitimate and legal and okay. They have no compunction about what they're doing. It's for the best. Right? It's called the Pax Romana. Right? So as the one historian says, that the Romans bring peace and they leave a desert behind. So I want to do a thought experiment. This is a lot of fun. We have this in class. All right? So here you are. You have to pretend, which requires an active imagination, which is the constitutive faculty you need to read Scripture. So use your imagination and pretend, make believe, right, that you are a person in the sort of the community that's been around maybe from the mid-50s, so who knows? This is like 67, so kind of a teenage community. And that the Romans are going around rounding up people in order to sort of give the payback for the Jewish revolt. Some people think that Nero is scapegoating Christians because of the fire, trying to shift the blame. I don't know if that has historical weight anymore, but I kind of made up the scenario kind of based upon that. Because we believe that the Markan community is in the wake of a persecution, right? So what does a persecution look like? Well, like this. So you're in bed, right? And the Romans come and drag you violently out and then take you to an interrogation chamber. And there's a centurion, the interrogator, right? The Grand Inquisitor. And he says to you, look, we know who you are. We know who you belong to. And that group you belong to, of course, you're a follower of an insurrectionist, of a rebel. And that if you follow him, then you must be also an insurrectionist and a rebel. So you have a choice, right? Give us 5 names of other, this is for you Star Wars fans out there, rebel scum, and we will let you walk out of here. And no one will know that you betrayed, right? Romans are pretty much good on their promises. I mean, they do believe kind of in law and order, and they want to get you to comply. And if you don't, there's your option B. And so he yells at you, choose. Now, it's your turn. All right? What do? There's no third option. You have to play the game. It's a forced option. Sorry. Don't tell me, well, what if, or how about? I'm sorry. Just play the game, okay? It's a game. But I'll set it up. It's not reality. It's not real life. What's your choice, A or B? So, choose now. All right. So, I usually make a show of hands and do a poll, but there's too many of you here. So I think the alternative is that if you choose, if you choose, that didn't scroll right. So if you choose option A, which is to betray your friends and fellow members of your community and save your skin and your families, or you can resist and lose your life. So let's just go ahead and go with A. So I'll just ask for the A folks. We won't ask for the B folks. The A folks to raise their hand. Just raise your hand if you're in the A crowd. A crowd? A crowd? Anybody? Lift it high because, you got to be proud of your choice, okay? A crowd? Okay, so you know who you are. You see your fellow A folks. The rest of you who have your hands down, you either not playing the game, which is not fair, or you're in the B crowd, all right? So, if you choose option A, you are dead. And the gospel you have no need for the gospel. It's not written for you. Obviously, you're dead. If you choose option B, you're alive, but you sure do feel dead. And Mark was written for you. So congratulations. Those of you who picked B, you can leave now. Just kidding. No, just kidding. You can stay because you want to know why you died, right? So the Mark community, in some sense, as we're speculating, is members who have survived a persecution. They're the survivors, and they're traumatized. I mean, the closest analog we have is people suffering from PTSD, right, which is common in soldiers, but you don't have to be a soldier. You can be a civilian, and we know plenty of places like Syria. Just think about the people in Syria. How many people who are still alive are suffering from just trauma for the rest of their lives from this event? So, and that's, the Romans are like the Syrian government. I mean, they just crush you. They have no problem. They don't have bombs and stuff, but they'll kill everybody without blinking an eye. So how do you survive a persecution, right? There's the multiple choice. A, B, C are typically, in a multiple choice, you want to pick all the above, huh? So you're suffering from unremittable, inextricable guilt and shame, despair. You are basically beyond help. You're in a hole so deep you can't get out of. You can't get yourself out of. Nobody can get you out of it. You're so enclosed in yourself that you can't see the light of day. So the gospel where I'm postulating is a gospel of second chances. You got a second chance. It's a rehab gospel, which, of course, rehab is the language we use for people who cannot help themselves anymore. Who need the helps of others, who need some way to bring them back from the dead of their own addiction or suffering. Hold on, I'll get you the questions later. Thanks. So how do you rehabilitate people? Well, you have to kind of use a two-armed approach, huh? With the one arm, you give them comfort. And you say, we understand, this makes sense. We feel, we empathize, we sympathize with you. We understand what you're going through. We understand how this led to this. But at the same time, you have to say, but that's not the end of the story. The story continues. Your life goes on. It's not over. So you both comfort and challenge. I think that's a decent strategy. I mean, I'm no psychologist. I've never worked in a rehab unit. I don't know anything what I'm talking about. But I'm just trying to make a case of a way to understand it that would make sense to us in our common understanding of the world today. So how do you comfort the people in the Gospel of Mark? What are your strategies? You're the evangelist saying, we've got to rehabilitate us, ourselves, our community, from the pits of despair and guilt. And so the first thing you do, as Mark Powell suggests in that little preview, is that you present a very human portrait of Jesus. Jesus is going to he's the most human in the sense of being frail and vulnerable, like all human beings are, and then any other gospel. And so, again, the oftentimes Jesus in Mark is called the man of sorrows, or the man of suffering. That's kind of a popular understanding which comes in medieval art. And it goes back again to the suffering. It's actually a translation of suffering in the Isaiah text, which we're going to come to near the end, which talks a lot about, which is the key text for understanding the entire Gospel of Mark. It's the suffering servant song. So these are the emotions that Jesus displays and the conditions in which he suffers from, his limitations in the Gospel of Mark. And they are, no pun intended, legion. Right? There's a lot. And compassion is, in some sense, the number one emotion that appears most often in Jesus. And I gave you the Greek translation because oftentimes, as we know, things are lost in translation. And so it's this, I listened to how to pronounce it, and now I can't on cue. But the idea is that this verb, right, means to be moved deeply in your bowels. It's not just some kind of feeling or kind of, but it's a visceral thing. It's in your body, right? You feel it down in the depths. So that's what Jesus is when his compassion is this Greek verb here. So you can see there's a whole variety of things that oftentimes we don't associate with Jesus. Jesus is not allowed to be angry, right? Sweet Jesus. And he's not allowed to be disabled. He can't be prevented. He's unstoppable. But actually, at some point, the lack of faith of people in the area that he's in prohibits him from being effective. He's tired and hungry. He doesn't know everything. He's not omniscient or clairvoyant, though he has some. Even in Mark, he sort of has the insights. But you don't have to be clairvoyant to see the writing on the wall, right? That's what he sees in Mark. Disappointed. He kind of loves the pathetic person who's kind of, like you should just dismiss him, but he doesn't. He's confrontational. He experiences pain and suffering more than the portrayal of Jesus' death is more intensely suffering. He cries out aloud. He feels forsakenness, right? So on the cross, Jesus' last words are, and they put it in the Aramaic, which then Matthew translates into the Hebrew, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which of course all the people who don't speak that think he's talking about Elijah. Eloi, Elijah? What? Can't hear you. What are you saying? So, which actually has another theological gloss on it. But so he experiences these things. And overall, from chapters 1 through 16, he's either ignored, disobeyed, or opposed. Not an easy life here. So Jesus is presented as a real human being. So the upshot is that Jesus is really frail and human, and you are too. There's some comfort in that, knowing that you can identify with him and he identifies with you. Another key factor is the total 100% mission failure of the disciples, especially the 12. The biggest bunch of dudderheads and ding-dongs you'll ever meet. Like, why would you choose these people? They're like, if these people worked for you, you had to fire every single one of them. Or if they were your friends, you would have to go find another set of friends. So it's the most negative portrayal, and oftentimes the text that's used to describe them is their hearts were hardened, which is a kind of a poetic way saying not only did they not get it, they didn't want to get it. Like they're like forcibly ignorant, invincibly ignorant, right? And that they left him and fled. With friends like that? All right, so how's examples of this? There's a multiple, about every single chapter, every single pericope is just demonstrating their complete, utter failure. I mean, it's just, you just go through it and you can see in every instance, they show absolutely no insights. And then when Peter has the one good insight, he blows the interpretation and actually has the wrong one. There's their obtuseness, their lack of faith and understanding. There's a whole poof. I'm not going to, you can go and read them later. They squabble amongst themselves. They're resentful. They're ambitious. Right? They like want to know, who's going to get sit your right and left hand? Those other people were doing something and it wasn't in your name. Is that okay? Can we stop them? Okay. So, and the children and And then, of course, their infidelity and their denial and betrayal. So, right? They fall asleep. Judas, betrays him. It's not even clear in Mark why he does it. In Matthew and Luke, they sort of begin to extrapolate on reasons and motivations, but on Mark, he just does it. No motivation. Don't know why. It's not relevant, but the kiss, in some sense, is very telling. They flee. Even in the women at the tomb, when the young man sitting in the tomb tells them to go do something, and they walk out and they're terrified. They don't do anything. It says, go and tell them they're going to be in Galilee. They can't even do that. So it's, again, the upshot for this, the comforting aspect, is that if the disciples, all of them, blew it, right? And especially Peter, number one in Star Trek language, it makes sense that the Markan survivors did so well. So they can identify, they can say, well, if the disciples blew it and you blew it, that makes sense. That's comforting. So, again, another comfort in the Gospel of Mark, which comes actually as a different kind of comfort, is not so much telling them that, you screwed up, or you're frail, so is Jesus is frail, and the gospel, and the disciples are kind of, they're like you. This third thing is very different. And it begins to kind of put the teeth on the fact that this is where they can find some hope. That Jesus is God's beloved Son. And he's Israel's Messiah. And he is the embodiment of God's empire. Now, I put that in quotations because empire has a completely negative, pejorative connotation. But as you could see, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, you could just substitute the word empire. And actually, he's making a statement about empire. So here's the question, right? Here's the question on everybody's mind at the time of Jesus' arising and the Markan community. Why are we, who are God's chosen, suffering? And the answer is there's one answer, which is that, we've failed to live up to the covenant, to be faithful to the covenant. God has been faithful, and that it's our own fault. So that's a sense of kind of what we call sin as culpability, which is what all of us focus on. Like, if you sinned, it was your choice. You're responsible. But then there's also a dimension which is kind of complex. It's also that there's kind of a captivity, that there are some really bad realities out there. There are some really externally malicious forces that, that make us suffer. And so in Mark, you have this profound sense of kind of Satan. The first one is like, the old adage, you reap what you sow, you make your bed, you have to lie in it. That's kind of the idea behind Israel's sense of culpability. But then she also has this idea, she also is God's chosen, but all the empires and the superpowers of the world have basically had their way with her. So just list them, right? Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Seleucids, and now Rome, which is just another one in the chain. And so they begin to say, hey, there's a pattern here. Maybe there's kind of these spiritual forces or powers that oppose and frustrate God, and that's the reason we're suffering. And in some sense, each empire is its own embodiment of Satan. Again, Satan for Mark is not some kind of boogeyman who exists independently, who's out there stalking people. No, he's always embodied in some form. And so for them, the empire is the supreme embodiment of the satanic forces. And you can see this, right? Because in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus exorcises the demoniac, the Gerasene demoniac, in which he sends the multiple spirits, the demonic spirits in this possessed man, into a bunch of swine, and then sends them off the cliff, right? And they ask him, what's your name? And he says, Legion. Now, is that just a passing reference? No, it's directly related to Rome. So Rome is demonic. It takes possession of people and destroys them. And so Jesus is going to be able to counter that. So the Roman Empire, in some sense, in collaboration with the Jewish elites, is part of the problem. So Jesus talks about the leaven of the Herodians, the leaven of Herod, and the leaven of the Pharisees, or the religious leaders and religious elite. So how does God fix this problem? So this is problem, a recognition that there are these forces at work that are larger and oppressive, and what is God going to do about it? And so the answer, and God's going to fix the problem in some ways that God always fixes the problem, or has the pattern of it. And God's solution in this case is his own son, which is the embodiment of him. So if Rome is the embodiment of the empire, right, Jesus is the embodiment of God. So he has God's power. Just like Rome has Satan's power, Jesus has God's power. And that's what Mark is interested in, as we'll see in a second. So what does Jesus do? Well, his job is to announce the good news and enact the new exodus of the inbreaking of the empire of God, the basileia to theo, which overthrows the empire, the rule of Satan. That's the idea. That's the kind of basic, and you see that the Mark community, right? Who's oppressing them? Rome. So it's a God versus Jesus battle. And see, the thing is, what Mark wants to make very clear to us, or clear to the community, is that there's no contest here. It doesn't go 10 rounds. It's not like a wrestling match or a boxing match that goes 10 rounds. Basically, Jesus walks in and just TKOs him. He just says, get out, to the demoniac. There's no struggle. There's no battle. There's no kind of, it's not like Elijah versus the prophets of Baal, where it's this major kind of cosmic battle. No, Jesus just says, out, boom, gone. So there is no, the battle is over before it begun. And so that's very comforting to the people, know that this is, the victory has been won. There is no real conflict. And so God's strategy for victory, though, is not just that, but it actually points to a deeper reality, which is the strategy of the crucified yet risen one. That God wins, right, or conquers or is victorious by losing. What? That's discombobulating. God, in some sense, the strategy God has is a lot like, you can't fight fire with fire, right? You can fight fire by removing the oxygen that fuels it. And that's what Jesus does on the cross and in the resurrection. That's what God does through Jesus on the cross and in the resurrection. Basically sucks the air out of the Romans' ability to legitimately oppress other people by exposing the violence inherent in their legal system. Because they think they're doing right. They think they're justified in their oppression. We're just bringing peace to you people. You people have no business to govern yourselves. Your religion is inadequate, just adopt ours, or we'll make yours a part of ours, no big deal. So he changes the rules of the game. But let's be clear about one thing, is that even though the enemy is Rome and her minions and the Jewish collaborators, that Mark refuses to, quote-unquote, demonize the entire lot of people. So there's always a sympathetic character who actually, the only sympathetic characters are actually sort of converts from the dark side, right? So you have Levi, the tax collector. Okay, so he gets rehabilitated, and he's a part of the oppressive. He collaborates with the Romans in order to extract the wealth from the poor and give it to the Romans. So there's a rehabilitation. There's a tax collector who gets it. There's the rich man, right? How do you get rich in this world? Well, you have to exploit other people. And so the rich man comes and he wants to know how, and Jesus tells him, and of course he can't do it, but at least he's sympathetic. And then there's Joseph Arimathea, who is, I think changes his mind about his vote to put Jesus to death and becomes a part of the procession to bury him. And then there's, of course, the most important figure is that who's the first person to recognize that Jesus on the cross is God's Messiah? The centurion, the same guy who just tortured you, or just offered you the option of, shameful life or brutal death. So the fact that the centurion, not the disciples, are the ones who recognize so Mark refuses, and so should we. When we demonize other groups of people, when we just totally dismiss them, i.e. Muslims, right? Then we're not even following the gospel's tradition here. So yes, in some sense, Rome, but see, even if you were to eliminate Rome, for the Jewish mind, Satan would just take some other embodiment. So just cutting off the head of the empire snake won't do the job. You have to go to what is its root. Through suffering, though suffering seems interminable, God, through suffering, has opened the pathway of dealing with it. Which in some ways, God's not minimizing. So there's two ways to deal with suffering. One is you can minimize it or blame somebody else. Like, well, it's somebody else's fault. It's free will. People suffer because of the free will of others. Or you can minimize it. It's like, well, it's not really that bad, which, of course, is always the position of people who don't suffer. Or you can try to eliminate it. So another way of getting rid of suffering is just eliminate suffering. Right? Just get rid of it. Just either socially engineer it or through political activity or warfare. Get rid of suffering. Get rid of suffering through warfare. Okay? But the way God does it is God actually transforms suffering in God's own, in Jesus, who is the embodiment of God. Takes on the suffering, transforms the suffering. So, the answer to suffering in some ways is suffering. But it's a transformed, and it's very complex. And it's very hard to get your mind around, but we'll try to talk about it a little bit in a minute. I think I'm running grossly over time, but we'll try to shoot through this. So another thing that's comforting is that this idea that the new age, the new epoch has begun, that the old has passed, that with the resurrection, something new has happened. Yet it's eschatological in the sense that you have to get your mind around the idea that the new age has begun, which is hopeful, but it's not yet manifest. It's not complete. So there's both this kind of affirmation, which is very difficult for people to understand, that this has happened. The kingdom is in your midst, the kingdom in your hearing, and it's been, all that kind of thing. But also, Rome hasn't left. Rome isn't gone. The Jewish priestly caste will be gone soon, but they'll be gone in 70, but it's not over. And the other thing that Jesus does is sort of begins to initiate this process in which the outsiders become insiders. And this is a very profound literary device and that the insiders become the outsiders, which both counts for the disciples. And so how does this look? Well, in Jesus' miracles, which are not called miracles, by the way, in the Gospels, and there's three types. There's healings, exorcisms, and then the cosmic miracles of the feeding, the walking on the water, the calming of the storm. What do? Well, their manifestations are enactments of the kingdom, that the kingdom is present. They're like signs that the kingdom is now. Now. So what they do is they restore both Israel, they restore the individual, in inclusion, and they also overthrow, quote unquote, the strong man. So they have all those characteristics. And in some sense, like I said, the name that Mark uses for what we call miracles is dynamis, which is power. But you think power pejoratively, like, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolute. No, it's not that kind of power. It's like the electric company, right? It's like flowing through Jesus. The power of God flows through him like a conduit. So he's like a conduit of God. And the signs are the inbreaking of the kingdom of God over Satan's kingdom. Jesus, who then is the eschatological change, because Jesus, who is the ultimate outsider, the crucified one, becomes the ultimate insider. He's an insignificant person from an insignificant place, from an insignificant people, but he's God's beloved. He's Son of God. And he teaches with God's authority. The ultimate outsider becomes the ultimate insider. And so authority is a big key idea in Mark. He has different names. People call him those things. He also does something that it probably is what gets him in trouble with the religious authority. He co-opts a prerogative or a power of God, which is to forgive sin. You're thinking, oh, well, that's no big deal. But to them, it's a big deal. That's something that belongs to God, and Jesus claims it as his own in Mark, which, again, is comforting. And he judges with God's authority. So both in his teaching, acting, and judging, he has been given, by divine prerogative, he is the Son of God. And that's what the gospel begins with that affirmation. And then his resurrection, in some sense, from his crucifixion, which makes him the ultimate outsider, foreshadows our resurrection, so vindication. And the upshot is that, the victory over suffering has been won in some ways, but is not fully realized, which is both a comfort and a challenge. So the game isn't over, you got to get in the game. The challenges come in a variety of forms, and as Mark Powell points out, is that one is the centrality and the necessity of the cross. And I put necessity in quotations because I want to be very clear about this. It trips people up. The watershed event in the Gospel of Mark, there's 16 chapters in Mark. Chapter 8, dead center in the middle, is this episode in which Peter, Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And a lot of people say this, that, and the other, Elijah, blah, 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 John the Baptist's return. And Peter says, you're the Messiah. You're the Messiah. And Jesus says, you got it, right? Of course, we'll see Matthew changes that a little bit, and Luke changes that, but Mark, it's just really straightforward. And then, of course, Jesus tells him in his first passion prediction, well, you know what that means, right, Peter? And he tells him straight. And then Peter does what? He pulls him aside and says, hey, Jesus, we don't know what he says, but I'm pretending, right? He says, hey, Jesus, that way you understand the Messiah thing, that's not how it's supposed to go down. I didn't sign on for that, man. We're supposed to be on the top, not on the bottom, right? We're the victors, not we're the Maccabees. Remember the Maccabees? That's what we're looking for. And he's like, And what does he say to him? He rebukes him back, saying, get behind me. Right? He's not calling him the devil with pitchforks. He's saying, you think like Rome. You use Roman logic in how we should conquer and defeat our enemy. So this is his thing after he says, well, here's the conditions for discipleship. And you can see where it applies directly to the Markan community. For whoever wishes to save his or her life for my sake in the gospel. Notice it's really not about Jesus, huh? Jesus is not about himself in Mark. He doesn't talk about himself. He's like incessantly pointing to himself. He's always pointing to the kingdom or the Father, right? He's not a narcissist or an egocentric guy. So this is kind of this is a challenge to the Markan community. Like, okay, so get back in the game. You got a second chance. Get in there. So one of the biblical commentators has said, well, following Jesus requires a readiness. Not necessarily a necessity, but a readiness to face hardship or suffering. But my point is that if you stand up to the powers that be, they will try to squash you. So you will suffer if you're about the business of the kingdom. You guaranteed, right? So it's not that, a lot of people think, well, God wants us to suffer. No, God doesn't want us to suffer. God wants us to be obedient to God's wishes for the way the world should be, which means that you're going to be in direct conflict with other realities, satanic realities, who actually have the opposite idea. So it's not that it's necessary or it's good, it's just inevitable if you're about that business, right? If you're trying to undo the evil sin of the world, the evil and the sin of the world is going to not lie down and take it lightly. How did they get there in the first place? All right, so the idea here is that Jesus on the cross, how Jesus basically snuffs out or takes the oxygen out of the room of the Roman fury, is that Jesus allows the powers to do the worst they can do to him, but doesn't return the favor. So the old saying, is that the buck stops here, right? That's on Truman's desk. Well, the buck stops with Jesus. He's not going to return the favor, even though he's in the right to return. He's innocent. He's been unjustly murdered. He's the Son of God, but he doesn't take out his vengeance. That's the Roman way. That's the empire's way. So he throws a wrench in the escalating cycle of violence by just saying, we're stopping here. Enough. This is not the way to live. So again, the upshot is that the Markan folks have this hope that if they get back and they pick up their cross, which again is not just like, it's not like the everyday burdens of life. It's basically about actively, non-violently resisting the powers and challenging them. So all you have to do is, who's the model of that in the 20th century? You don't have to look far for it. In the 20th century in the United States of America, Dr. Martin Luther King, that he understood this in his bones and his movement and the African American community who goes down to Montgomery. Like, why would you do that? You're forcing the issue. They're going to kill you. Well, I mean, King should have stayed in Boston at the Boston University and been a professor like me. I mean, he had a doctorate. Why not just stay out of the battle? But he doesn't. So that's the idea. Now, just real quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but I promise to stop. In some sense, the key text, and this is for your meditation and your prayer, that in some ways Mark in the back of his mind has this text, which is one of the most perplexing, cryptic texts in all of Hebrew Scripture. And it's been debated and not clear, like, who's the servant? Is it Israel? Is it a particular individual? Is it somebody coming? Who knows, right? But I think in Mark's narrative of the gospel is the answer. He answers this question. And for him, it's Jesus of Nazareth. But why must people suffer? Why must the servant suffer, or he or she or them, for the people? Why do the people suffer in the first place? Why does God will that the servant suffers? If you just read this straight up, like for this face value, it seems perverse and grotesque. But if you read it in a deeper way, in light of the way the cross is understood by Mark, the passion, then you begin to make sense of it. We can talk more about this in the spring, because that is about the kind of soteriological significance of the death of Jesus. The other key text is in Mark. So there's allusions to the suffering servant text, but in the Mark itself, the other text that's very prominent is Jesus' last words. Now, did Jesus say all these words? No, he only gets the first line out. And then he expires. But it starts off as a cry of lamentation. That's what it is. It's a form of Jewish prayer called lamentation, which is a completely pious, holy way for a Jew to talk to God. It's not protest for the sake of protest, but it's the cry of the people in their belief that God will be faithful to the covenant. And so it starts off with this kind of lamentation, but with an affirmation of the Holy One. And then another kind of, cry of lament. But then how does it end? Right? In the end, it's vindication. So this lamentation begins with the cry of despair and abandonment, and then ends with vindication and restoration. And so Jesus begins the prayer on the cross, and people often read that and say, oh, look, he lost his faith. He doesn't believe in God anymore. No, he's just being a good Jew. He's simply praying the prayer that a Jew would pray in this situation, and he just doesn't get to finish. So, Jesus dies not finishing the psalm, but dies believing that God will vindicate him. And the challenge for the Markan community is to have the same faith. See, Jesus doesn't get to the end. And Jesus doesn't know on the cross that he will be vindicated or how he will be vindicated. He has faith he will be vindicated. That's in hope that he'll be vindicated. And so at the end, so are there any resurrection narratives in the Gospel of Mark? No, it just ends at chapter 16. Bang, fade to black. The women are afraid. No resurrection appearances. Why? Why is Mark not saying, and they live happily ever after? Because the audience that it's written for needs to wait to get back in the game in order for the resolution to happen. It's a device that allows the Markan community to say, we're not going to get the vindication yet before we have to undergo the same process. The final thing is this idea of the Messianic secret, which Powell talks about, which is a challenge for the listeners of the Markan community, the audience, is that the idea is that many times in the gospel, which only happens in Mark, Jesus will do something and then he'll tell people to not say anything about it. He'll silence them or tell them don't tell anybody, or he'll quiet them. And so in the first half of the gospel, there's many different characters, the demons, the ones who are healed. And sometimes, remember, in the gospel, Jesus doesn't heal everybody. Sometimes people just come and take the healing from him. So there's the woman who's hemorrhaging, right? Who touched me? He doesn't even know. And she just basically drew the power right out of him. So, they're healed, but it's her faith. It's her faith that made her whole. Right? So it's a very interesting kind of take on that. And then his disciples. And so this thing that's called the Messianic secret, which is a hypothesis formed by this German fellow, but I think his explanation is a little off. We won't go into it. But the idea here is that Mark uses this little literary device to make sure that the audience doesn't mistake the trees for the forest. That they don't focus on Jesus as a wonder worker who solves their problems. That's the idea. Come rescue us, solve our problem. That's what we want. We want a savior. And Jesus instead says, nope, you got to save yourself. Here's the way. Here's the cross. And that the cross is the focus for Mark. And that it unlocks the meaning of all the other powerful, mighty deeds. And so this last comment, that everything that comes before the passion points to the passion, and as well as the Last Supper, which we don't have time to talk about, but that in some sense is the ultimate messianic interpretation of Jesus' own death. But then you have all these amazing acts, but the idea is like, don't focus on this. So you got to keep your eyes on the prize, which of course comes from Dr. King, right? Keep your eyes on the prize. And not confuse Jesus as this mighty hero, warrior, like a miracle worker who fixes our problems. But instead, all the mighty acts point to the mighty deeds of power, point to the kingdom, the inbreaking of the kingdom, that the kingdom is here and now. Not in the distant future, but here and now.